Noswaith dda gyfeillion, croeso i chi gyd i seminar gyntaf ganolfan uwchhyfrydiau Cymreig a Cheltaidd ar gyfer y flwyddyn 2021. Elin Haf Griffith Jones di'n enw fi ac fi yw cyfarwyddwr y ganolfan uwchhyfrydiau Cymreig a Cheltaidd. Mae bleser mawr iawn gen i gael bod yma heddiw a chadeirio'r sesiwn gyntaf hon i mi, a dwi'n ddiolchgar iawn am y croeso arbennig dwi wedi cael wrth i fi ymgymryd ar swydd newydd. Mi fydd nifer o bobl yn ymuno â ni drwy Zoom, ac mi fydd na eraill yn gallu gwylio yr recordiad ar Facebook Live. Croeso cynnes i chi ble bynnag ydych chi. Very warm welcome to everybody who is able to join us this evening for the first of the Centre for Advanced Welsh and Celtic Studies seminar for 2021. I'm Elin Haf Griffith Jones. I'm new in post and I've had a wonderfully warm welcome from all staff and other colleagues further afield as well, and I'm truly grateful for that. We have some people joining us on Zoom and others joining us through Facebook. We will have a speaker, a seminar speaker, and then after that we will have opportunities for questions. Felly, yn gyntaf oll, dwi am estyn croeso arbennig i Dr Rebecca Thomas. Mae Rebecca Thomas yn gymrawd ôl-ddoethurol yr Academi Brydeinig yn adran hanes, athroniaeth a gwyddorau cymdeithas ym Mhrifysgol Bangor. Dr Thomas is British Academy Postdoctoral Fellow at the School of History, Philosophy and Social Sciences at Bangor University. She studied for her doctorate at the Department of Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic at the University of Cambridge after obtaining an MPhil degree from the same department and a BA degree in history, also at the University of Cambridge. She specialises in the history of medieval Britain, and her current project investigates political relations between Wales and the wider world during this period. Rebecca, felly, gai estyn croeso cynnes iawn i chi i gyflwyno eich papur chi, not of the same language, the use of anghyfiaith in medieval Welsh texts.
Diolch yn fawr, diolch am y gwahoddiad a'r croeso. Any given identity is the result of a complex process of construction and reconstruction. In the Middle Ages, poets, lawyers, and the compilers of prose texts worked hard to define communities of different sorts, outlining their parameters and who could and could not be admitted and why. They had a number of strategies at their disposal. And there were a number of ways a group could be defined as different to other groups. So, for example, you have the construction of origin legends, the use of laws, geographical and political boundaries. Language was also important. Of course, in practice, not all communities would have been monolingual, especially in border regions, and you would also have had different dialects. Nevertheless, there is plenty of evidence that medieval writers perceived language as an important way of distinguishing between groups. So a well-known example in his Historia Ecclesiastica in the 8th century, Bede connected the 4 languages spoken in Britain with 4 different peoples, as well as a 5th language, Latin, which was spoken by all. In Welsh texts, there are instances of iaith, language, being used as a synonym for people. So in Llyfr Taliesin, for example, a praise poem refers to the kings of every iaith, that is, every people, being faithful to Irian Rheged. And such usage is common in the poems of Beirdd y Tywysogion in the 12th and 13th centuries and beyond. In these texts, then, people can be defined by their language. Now, I'm particularly interested in this usage of iaith and 2 other words that are linked to this. Anghyfiaith, not of the same language, or speaking or pertaining to a foreign language, or following the equation of iaith with people, perhaps simply foreign. And then cyfiaith, the other side of the coin, of the same language. These terms occur in a number of different texts, and they're frequently highlighted by editors as noteworthy, often as a way of constructing national identity in these texts. But there hasn't been a study that brings all usages together. So today I'm going to focus on anghyfiaith, drawing on examples of cyfiaith we're illuminating. And I won't be going through every single example of anghyfiaith, but I'll be attempting to draw out some trends in its usage, thinking about what exactly this means, this word means in these texts, and in what contexts specifically is it being used. There'll be three main categories of evidence that I'll consider: legal texts, poetry, and prose. In the legal material and in the poetry, the focus will primarily be on how anghyfiaith is used to distinguish between Welsh and non-Welsh speakers. The prose evidence will complicate matters a little. In some cases, we'll see that it's those who cannot speak Latin that are referred to as anghyfiaith. I'll be focusing primarily on the poetry and the prose, but I will say something about the legal material to start with. There aren't very many examples of anghyfiaith in the legal material, but its occasional occurrence illustrates that language was sometimes used as a means of categorization. And with these legal texts, we can compare its usage in the different Welsh versions as well as in the Latin texts, although of course the relationship between these is complicated and they are of an uncertain date. In some cases, the anghyfiaith are a category that cannot take part in certain legal processes. And we see this in draddodwyd, the extract that's on the slide, where they cannot act as sureties. So these are the people who are not entitled to become a surety or to give a surety. Nidam gen mynach, miadur dyn anghyfiaith ac ysgol haig ysgol. So an anghyfiaith person is not allowed to act as surety. And the key point, as the passage goes on to say, is that these are people who cannot serve the law without the leave of another. Now, this example is particularly interesting because in other texts that give a similar passage, so in Cyfnerth Blagored and in the Latin texts, there's a similar passage about those who are not allowed to give sureties, and the reference is to an alltid, an exile, rather than dyn anghyfiaith. So it might be that in draddodwyd here, anghyfiaith is being used as a way of referring to an exile, someone from somewhere else. So perhaps more in the sense of foreign from the list of definitions that I showed you earlier. So the linguistic connotations might not be so important in this context. But this is in contrast to other instances of anghyfiaith, where it's used in contexts in the laws where there are clear practical implications linked to linguistic capability. So the example that we have on the slide here, the top example, those who have a right to tafodiawg, a tongued one in court, gwraig, alltid, anghyfiaethus, a chrig, and Ionawr. So this is somebody who, this is a list of people who have a right for somebody to speak for them in court. So here it's likely that the inability of the alltid to speak the language that is important. They can't represent themselves. Blagorid is on the whole a Welsh translation of an earlier version of the Latin text D, and in the Latin text there is a similar statement, but here instead of anghyfiaith, it has an exile who is not able to speak correctly in Welsh. So it's specifying that the iaith that they cannot speak is Welsh. And then the final example also on the slide is from Cyfnerth, where we have a reference to those who do not have to take a llw gweilydd, and this includes myd a byddar ac anghyfiaethus. So as with the mute and the deaf, there are probably practical reasons for the inclusion of anghyfiaith on this list. So in the laws, anghyfiaith is sometimes, in Llyfr in particular, used, it seems, to in the context of describing alltyd, exile, otherwise used to describe non-Welsh speakers in a practical context, those who are not able to take part in certain legal proceedings because they are not familiar with the language. There are numerous examples in poetry of anghyfiaith being used to describe non-Welsh speakers. The first example that I have here is from Arthur and Mordred, a poem in the Black Book of Carmarthen. In this poem, Mordred has been driven mad after the Battle of Arthur and is conversing with a pig and prophesying future events. There are references to some historical figures, and a reference to conflict between Llywelyn and John might be linked to the events of 1211 to 1212, when the English king burned Bangor and captured the bishop. And if so, part of the poem at least is dated between 1212 and the manuscript's compilation in 1250, but of course other sections might be of a different date. Now, the reference to anghyfiaith comes later in the poem as Myrddin prophesies is a world turned upside down, and that includes esgib anghyfiaith difaith difydd, so wicked, faithless anghyfiaith bishops. The poet then pairs the statement that the bishops are anghyfiaith with the claim that they are also faithless. This is a list of bishops acting in a way that is inappropriate and unacceptable, and this is a theme that the poet returns to elsewhere in the poem. But crucially, a part of this inappropriate behaviour is the fact that they are anghyfiaith. Now, the use of anghyfiaith here is interesting because there is some evidence of unhappiness over the appointment of non-Welsh speaking bishops to ecclesiastical office in Wales in the 12th and 13th centuries. In his De Jure et Statu Menevensis Ecclesiae, composed around 1218, Gerald of Wales reproduces a letter that he claims was sent to the Pope by Llywelyn ap Iorwerth and the princes of Powys and Deheubarth at the beginning of the 13th century. The letter warns the Pope that the Archbishop of Canterbury have been forcing bishops on the Welsh who do not understand their language or customs. According to the letter, the bishops were unable to preach or listen to confession without a translator present. Now, there are doubts over the authenticity of this letter, whether it's a forgery by Gerald or whether he's perhaps placed it in a different context in his text. But whether it's an authentic letter or not, it does evidence the view that non-Welsh speaking bishops were a problem in the 12th and 13th centuries. And there's some further evidence of this in the number of non-Welsh bishops that were driven out of the bishopric of Bangor in this period. Oianau Myrddin is a little unusual in referring to a clerical enemy as anghyfiaith. It's more often used in poetry to refer to a secular enemy. And we see this in the poems of Beirdd Tywysogion. But first, there's one example in a poem from the book of Taliesin. Drydodwyd Duw ar Plwyf Brython. It's unfortunately of uncertain date, so it can't be placed in, securely in any historical context. The poet prophesies the coming of Cadwallon across the Irish Sea and the vengeance of the Welsh for the death of Idwal. Then we have the statement that, well, may he wreak havoc on the speckled cat and her anghyfiaith ones. Now, the anghyfiaith ones here are likely the Saxons who are mentioned in the previous line. Anghyfiaith isn't used in any other prophecy in the Book of Taliesin to describe the Saxons. They are frequently referred to as gunnon in this material, a word deriving from Latin gentes and used in Welsh texts to refer to pagan peoples. So the focus is often on their paganism rather than their language. But through using anghyfiaith to describe the Saxons, the poet is categorizing us and them according to language. And we see more of this in the poems of Beirdd y Tywysogion. And there are 3 that are relevant here, 2 from the 12th century, 1 from the 13th. Madr nad Owain Gwynedd, the poet tells us that facing the anghyfiaith doesn't bring him any joy after the death of Owain. So the implication is likely that this is something that Owain used to do, and now that Owain's dead, it brings no joy to the poet. Owain ap Madog is described as Gelyn anghyfiaith. The use of re here might imply that Owain being called an enemy of anghyfiaith is a good thing. It's something to aspire to. Candelw also describes Owain as ysgwyd pedair iaith, the defender or shield of the 4 nations or peoples or languages. So this phrase pedair iaith, so with the iaith language or people and pedair 4, appears in several poems of Beirdd y Tywysogion, and its meaning is a little ambiguous. It's been suggested that it's a reference to the 4 parts of Britain, Wales, England, Scotland, Cornwall, or perhaps Ireland, the 4 languages spoken in Britain, the 4 parts of Wales, the 4, or even the 4 different groups of Britons, so the Welsh, the Cornish, the Cumbrians and the Bretons. Pedair could even be interpreted as perfect here, so shield, defender of the perfect language or perfect people. But however we interpret pedair iaith, language is clearly an important part, playing an important part in the way that Owain is being praised in this poem. And there's an even greater focus on language in Mawl Llywelyn ap Gruffydd by Llygad Gwr. Peredur Lynch has noted that this poem contains a number of standard characteristics that you would expect to see in a praise poem. So we have praise of Llywelyn's generosity, for example, his prowess in battle. But it's also nationalistic, he says, cenedlaetholgar, and an anti-English poem. The poet stresses Llywelyn's identity as a Welshman, together with the unity of Wales, describing Llywelyn as Taleithawg, crowned ruler of Aberthraw, Dynevor, and Mathrafal, the main courts of Gwynedd, Powys, and Deheubarth. The reference to Llywelyn as anghyfiaith fits in this context. Just looking at the second part of the extract that's on the slide, to start with. Lord Llywelyn, ruler of Pedair Iaith, stood in battle, a clear course. Rhagestrawn genedl gwyn anghyfiaith. So against a foreign nation of anghyfiaith, lamentation. This example is a bit different to the others discussed so far, because anghyfiaith is referring to the complaint of the foreign people specifically. Llygad Gwr is stressing that it is their language that is different here. So even though we have the acquainting of iaith with nation or people, the linguistic dimension is still at the forefront. Going back to the first part of that extract, Llywelyn's army is also described as cyfiaith, gad, gowyw, gyfiaith. So there is a clear contrast being drawn between Llywelyn's cyfiaith army and the enemy's coin anghyfiaith. This is particularly interesting because there isn't another example of cyfiaith and anghyfiaith occurring in the same poem in the works of Beirdd y Tywysogion. There are a number of instances where cyfiaith is used as a way of stressing the closeness of a relationship between the poet or his subject and someone else. So to give one example, we have this in Canu Cadfan by Llywelyn Fardd from the mid-12th century. It's used to describe the relationship between Cadfan and Lleuad, his successor, on an essentially dau gyfiaith, so two deer, two cyfiaith, and then this connection is reinforced by a reference to the two men as dau gefnderw, two cousins, a few lines later. On the whole, the references to cyfiaith in the works of Beirdd y Tywysogion follow a similar pattern, using cyfiaith to describe a personal relationship, and the relationship between an individual and cyfiaith is special. Mawl Llywelyn ap Gruffydd's use of cyfiaith then, where it's offering a contrast between Llywelyn's army and their enemy, is unique. Status as cyfiaith is consistently presented as a positive thing. So the fact that Llywelyn has a cyfiaith army and that's a good thing isn't unusual. But this clear dichotomy isn't seen elsewhere. And it's interesting because the instinct, I think, is to see cyfiaith and anghyfiaith as two sides of the same coin, as I said earlier, but rarely are they actually presented as such in these texts. And that's a point that I'll return to when I look more closely at some examples in the prose texts. So it's generally acknowledged that Mawl Llywelyn ap Gruffydd is an incredibly nationalistic poem, and it stands out really in this respect. But this focus on language with references to anghyfiaith, cyfiaith and pedariaeth also implies a close association between this nationalism and language. The implication of the contrasting of cyfiaith and anghyfiaith is that language is important to the definition of the unity of Wales. Llywelyn's status as ruler of the three courts of Wales interacts with the idea that his followers are cyfiaith. Language is clearly then being called upon to construct Welsh identity. Before moving on to consider prose, I should stress that not every example of anghyfiaith in the poetry follows this pattern. And we can look at one example that's a little bit different. This is from another poem in the Black Book of Carmarthen, the Dadl y Corff ar Enaid, dated 12th century. Here the body and the soul are conversing as the body suffers from an illness. And the soul is warning the body over its behaviour, and it's outlining how a good Christian should behave. And this is where this is the context for the reference to anghyfiaith. So one of the sins that the body is accused of is using many anghyfiaith words in its speech. Margaret Haycock interprets this as a reference to improper words, so perhaps words from other languages such as English or French. But using anghyfiaith words here is a sin, implying a negative attitude towards other languages. And there might be a link then also if we think that using anghyfiaith words is improper, then perhaps there is a link between that there are negative connotations to those who speak these other languages. So there is some variation in the way that anghyfiaith is used in the poetry, although more often than not it is being used to describe as an enemy, clerical enemy in Ionawr Myrddin, but more common a secular enemy. What we've seen in the texts so far is not really that surprising. Anghyfiaith is used to refer to non-Welsh speakers normally in a negative manner in the poetry and simply as a category in the laws. Prose texts complicate this picture somewhat. Every example of anghyfiaith in the prose texts comes from texts dating from the 13th century or later, and they are all to some degree translations of Latin sources. Most examples are found in Brita Brenhinedd, the Welsh translations of Geoffrey of Monmouth's De Gestis Britonum, but there are also examples in Historia Griffith fab Cynan, Bichad Beino, Fel y Cabas Elen y Grog, Historia de Carlo Magno, and Brita Tywysogion. This puts us in a useful situation because we can often compare the Welsh with the Latin that it's a translation of. So we can see what anghyfiaith is translating, and which helps us understand a bit better why it's been included. Again, I'm not going to go through every example, but I will draw out some general trends and then also look at a few examples that suggest a more complicated picture. So to begin with Historia Griffith fab Cynan, this is the 13th century biography of Griffith ap Cynan, ruler of Gwynedd. It's translated a translation of the Latin Vita Graphini, which was likely composed during the reign of Griffith's son Owain Gwynedd. There are two references to anghyfiaith in this text. In the first instance, it's in an account of Anglo-Norman attacks on Gwynedd. Griffith ap Cynan himself has been driven overseas. The Anglo-Normans have captured Anglesey, and at that point a fleet led by Magnus of Norway appears on the horizon. The Earl Hugh of Shrewsbury is shot in the eye, and the Anglo-Normans are forced to retreat. Now, in describing the emergence, the appearance of this fleet, the biographer claims that it's been sent by God I ryddhau y bobl warchedig gan yr anghyfiaith, to free the wretched people from the anghyfiaith. And I've placed the Latin passage beneath that on the slide, and there is no equivalent to anghyfiaith in the Latin. So the Latin simply says, in order to at last free his people beset by misfortune. And the same is true of the second instance. So this occurs towards the end of the biography, where the biographer is simply outlining the situation as Griffith nears the end of his life. His sons are acting to defend Gwynedd, yn erbyn estrawn genhedloedd a rhai anghyfiaith, against foreign peoples and anghyfiaith ones. And again, the Latin simply has extranis nationibus, foreign peoples. So the translator translates that as estrawn genhedloedd and then adds a rhai anghyfiaith. So in both instances, anghyfiaith is an addition, and there is no equivalent in the Latin. As I mentioned, most examples come from Brita Brenhinedd, so the translations of Geoffrey of Monmouth's De Gestis Britonum. We don't know when exactly Geoffrey's work was translated for the first time. The translations begin to appear in manuscripts from the middle of the 13th century. There are at least 4 different versions and over 20 manuscripts. And anghyfiaith is used in 4 different versions, and there are 15 examples in total. Anghyfiaith doesn't always occur in exactly the same passage in each version, so it is used in different contexts across the different versions of the text. All but 2 examples refer to the Saxons, as we can see in this example here, which is relating Uther Pendragon's success against them. And we are told that for yr anghyfeithion genhedloedd hynny, those anghyfiaith Gentiles fled. Now, this translation sticks pretty close to Geoffrey's text, which is below there, but anghyfiaith genhedlaeth is a translation of Barbary. Geoffrey uses Barbary to describe the Saxons as well as the Picts and the Irish frequently. What is implied in its usage is the paganism of these peoples, often contrasted with the Christian Britons. The Welsh translation in Brita Brenhinedd that we see here keeps this association with the use of Cenhedlaeth, a word that, again, like Gunnon, can just mean people but has pagan connotations. So it's often translated, well, Gentiles, as we have here, or heathen, and it's used frequently in the Welsh annals to refer to the Vikings. The translator then continues to stress the paganism of the Saxons with the use of Cenhedlaeth, but adds a linguistic dimension with anghyfiaith. It's not only their Christianity that is the defining feature of difference between the Britons and the Saxons, but also their language. In all but two cases in Brita Brenhinedd, anghyfiaith is translating some form of Barbary. And we see a similar usage here, this time in the Cotton Cleopatra version, this time relating the battle between Arthur and Mordred. And Arthur is giving a speech to his followers ahead of the battle, and he's saying that their enemy will never fight with one mind. Canis pobl cascal anghyfiaith ysgymyn int, because they're a collection of damned anghyfiaith. Now, the pobl cascal anghyfiaith are the Picts, Irish and Saxons. Again, if we just flick forward to Geoffrey, again translating a form of Barbary. The translation is a little looser here. So Geoffrey simply tells us that the barbarians disunited and from various lands were weak and untrained warriors who could not face the bravery and military experience of the British as long as they attacked boldly and fought valiantly. Now, going back to the Welsh translation, there is a focus on the Christianity of Arthur and his followers, in contrast to the pagans here, saying that we are Christians and in the right, and they are damned pagans and in the wrong. So it's likely that the translator is familiar with the connotations of Barbary and is really drawing out the idea that they're facing pagans here. And another point of interest is the pairing of anghyfiaith with cascal, pobl cascal anghyfiaith. The implication is that this is a rabble, a random collection of people. And we see that that's faithful really to what Geoffrey has. He says that they are diversos diversorum regnorum. But this is translated into a reference to language again here. So pobl cascal anghyfiaith. The implication might be that not only are they of a different language to the Britons, but they are also of a different language to each other. In other words, there's no linguistic bond between them. So the use of anghyfiaith might not just be a way of saying these people speak a different language. It might be that they also don't have their own shared language tying them together. In Brita Brenhinedd, then, language is an important part of how the enemies of the Welsh are described, whether they're Saxons, Irish or Picts. Language is a key difference between them and the Britons, and language is also recognised as something that binds a group together. And the number of references in texts from the 13th century, and Brita Brenhinedd especially, suggests that anghyfiaith had become a key part of the way enemies were described. And this doesn't mean a complete break with what came before, though. Anghyfiaith is integrated into this pre-existing framework for how these people were described, alongside other words such as Cenhedlaeth, or with an extra note on their paganism. Thus far, all the examples have been to describe non-Brittonic speakers, but that doesn't always have to be the case. So here we have an example in Historia de Carlo Magno, a series of Latin and all French texts about Charlemagne that have been translated and brought together in a cycle. It's uncertain, of uncertain date, although some of it was translated probably in the second half of the 13th century. Now, anghyfiaith occurs a few times in this collection, and there is one example on the slide. Roland is here greeting Christ on his death, and he says, cynnal dy ddeddf Cristnogaeth y deithio ni o'm gwlad iechyd anghyfiaith. So to preserve your law and your Christianity, I came from my country to anghyfiaith exile. Roland goes on to state that he has defeated the Saracens on numerous occasions through God's help, and he's been campaigning in Spain with Charlemagne, and the anghyfiaith presumably here refers to those who cannot speak his own language, whether that's perceived to be French or Latin. And again, some form of barbary is in the Latin that is being translated in Hisco Barbaris Oris. Generally, in recounting the battles of Charlemagne in Spain, Historia de Carlo Magno stresses the lack of faith of the enemy. Indeed, Natalia Petrovskaya has argued that the Welsh translations depict Charlemagne's battles as religious wars under the influence of the Crusades, more so than the Latin and French originals. The enemy is frequently referred to as Paganiaid, for example. And the use of anghyfiaith in this context raises the possibility that it's working in a similar way to Paganiaid in these texts. In other words, as a way of referring to those who are not familiar with Latin, the Latin of Christendom. And there's another example that's interesting in this regard. In Fel y Cafas Elen y Grog, based on the Latin Inventio Sancti Crucis, again of an uncertain date. So this is a tale of, this section anyway, is an account of Constantine facing an enemy on the river Danube. Yn y seithfed flwyddyn o'i deyrnas yr ymgynullasant cenedlaeth anghyfiaeth, I ymladd yn erbyn Rhifain ar afon Danube. So this is depicted as a battle between the barbarians and the Romans, and again, that's what we have in the Latin, gens multa barbarorum. But also, I think there's a spiritual dimension here. This is a battle between Christians and pagans, because the account goes on to explain that Constantine sees the shape of the cross in the sky and then adopts that signal for his army, and then is granted victory by God and builds churches as a consequence. So the use of barbari might also be distinguishing between the contrast is not just between the Romans and the barbarians, but the Christians and the barbarians. And the use of anghyfiaith to translate barbari here might be a reference then to those who were not Roman, but also not Christians. And a final example comes from the Red Book of Hergest version of Brita Tywysogion, which tells us that Robert, the brother of William Rufus, went to Jerusalem I ymladd â Saraceniaid a chenhedloedd eraill anghyfiaith ac I amddiffyn y Cristnogaeth to fight against the Saracens and other anghyfiaith peoples and to defend Christendom. So Brita Tywysogion refers to three closely related chronicles, the Red Book of Hergest version that we have here, Peniath 20 and Brenhina the Saeson. These vernacular chronicles are all thought to be independent translations of a lost Latin original, perhaps translations of different versions of this Latin original. For the 11th century, This Latin original was likely based on the same St. David's source that fed into the B and C texts of the Annales Cambriae. So it's useful to compare all of these sources. But the first thing to note is that this account of Robert going to Jerusalem isn't included in the B and C texts of Annales Cambriae. These simply refer to William Rufus going to Normandy. The C text specifies that he was attacking his brother. So we don't have a Latin text to compare with here. This doesn't mean that the account of Robert wasn't in the original source. It might simply have not been included in the B and C texts. But what complicates matters is that the reference to, while the reference to Robert going to Jerusalem occurs in all three Brita Tywysogion texts, the reference to ac yn heddlau eraill anghyfiaith only occurs in the Red Book of Hergest version. So it doesn't appear in Penna 20 or Brenhinedd y Saeson. So there's a possibility that there wasn't a Latin equivalent to cenhedloedd eraill anghyfiaith in the source used by the translator, that again, it's as with the historiographydd ab Canaan, it's just an addition. So here, cenhedloedd eraill anghyfiaith, along with the Saracens, are an enemy that Robert was fighting against. And it seems likely that the iaith that they were not of is Latin, and by extension, Christendom. Again, we have the label cenhedloedd with pagan connotations, and it's said that Robert is going to Jerusalem I amddiffyn y Gristnogaeth. So the cenhedloedd eraill anghyfiaith are those outside Christendom representing a threat to it. And this would be consistent with its use in Felicavas, Elena Grog, and perhaps also Historia de Carlo Magno. This further suggests that anghyfiaith might not always mean non-Welsh speakers in any given text, including perhaps some of the texts that I've looked at today. And this is especially significant considering the volume of examples where anghyfiaith is a translation of Barbary and is used alongside cenhedloedd, or with an additional comment on the lack of faith of the people in question. It might be significant that historically Barbary was used to refer to those of a different language outside classical civilization. So the use of anghyfiaith to translate this word with the connotations that the anghyfiaith might be those outside of Christendom is not inexplicable. It may be then that in these texts, anghyfiaith has become something of a stock phrase to be added to the collection of Welsh words used to describe other peoples with negative connotations. This doesn't mean that the linguistic element iaith is unimportant, but rather that it can be used in a broad range of contexts and not just to describe non-Welsh or non-Brittonic speakers. In particular, it might have been used in prose texts to refer to those outside the Christian world. While we've seen numerous examples in poetry where anghyfiaith is used as part of a building of a national identity focused on the followers of a particular Welsh ruler, we see here anghyfiaith being used to support the identity of the Welsh as Christians, together with those who might in other contexts be referred to as anghyfiaith themselves. This single word then is a window into the complex and multi-layered identities that were being constructed in these texts. Anghyfiaith is used in a wide range of medieval Welsh texts, just to bring these different strands together. In the use of anghyfiaith, these texts highlight language as a distinguishing between us and them on linguistic grounds. This is further reinforced when anghyfiaith is contrasted with cyfiaith, as in Mawl Llywelyn ap Gruffydd. In the poetry, anghyfiaith is used across a variety of genres, including prophetic poetry, praise poetry, and gnomic poetry. Because of the uncertainty surrounding the date of some of these poems, it's difficult to establish any sort of chronological pattern. But its use in praise poetry is fairly consistent. It's a term used to describe the enemy opposed to the ruler in question. However, it should be stressed that the number of instances in the works of Bertha Tywysogion are small, considering the size of the corpus. So not all poems of the 12th and 13th centuries display a preoccupation with language as a distinction between peoples. even looking at those poems that do use anghyfiaith. Some are more preoccupied than others. So Mawl Llywelyn ap Gruffydd is a good example of this because of the multiple words connected to language that are used and the links between these and ideas of national identity. The use of anghyfiaith in prose texts is more concentrated. The legal material aside, all instances occur in translation texts dated to the 13th century. Within these texts, anghyfiaith is used to describe the enemy, sometimes a specific enemy, the Saxons more often than not, occasionally the Irish and the Picts, but elsewhere more generally simply an enemy. The implication in many cases is that anghyfiaith are non-Brittonic speakers. But there is also a possibility that the anghyfiaith are sometimes non-Latin speakers and by extension non-Christians. And this is what we've seen with Brita Tywysogion's reference to Robert of Normandy waging war against the anghyfiaith for the sake of Christendom. The frequency of occurrences of anghyfiaith in these translation texts in any case illustrates that it become a part of the vocabulary of these writers when seeking to describe a people in a negative way, alongside cenhedlaeth. The meaning of this word then could shift depending on context, and in different texts contributed to ideas of Welsh and Christian identities. But its usage across a wide variety of texts, especially in the 12th and 13th centuries, illustrates a preoccupation with linguistic difference, even if the iaith that the anghyfiaith were not a part of wasn't always the same. Diolch yn fawr.
Diolch yn fawr iawn. Diolch yn fawr iawn I ti. Hoffwn I agor nawr I ni gael cwestiynau a sylwadau. So we'd like to have comments and questions now. Please feel free to open your microphones and also to put your cameras on hefyd. Croeso chi roed eich camerâu, a does dim rhaid I ni gael trefn ffurfiol iawn. Dwi'n yn credu gall pobl gyflwyno I hunan a chyflwyno cwestiwn neu sylw fel mynna nhw. Please speak freely.
Could I ask a question about if I may, about the word cyfiaith? I'm wondering whether it would be useful to pursue the senses of cyfiaith a bit more as a way of approaching the semantics of anghyfiaith. I was particularly struck by the example from Canu Cadfan, we're referring to Cadfan and his cousin as Dau Gyfiaith, if I remember rightly, where it seems to me that the cyfiaith has been used in the sense of close companion there. And you do get that with some other words formed with cyf. They've been used in a very positive sense. It's suggesting close unity, like cyfaith, obviously, and cyfoed. I think in both those cases, there are examples where the emphasis doesn't really seem to be on the primary meaning of the second element, oed or eicht, and maybe in this sense, in this case also iaith is not being foregrounded. And I wonder whether that could perhaps suggest that anghyfiaith, being in the first instance the negation of cyfiaith, it could also be used in the same way without foregrounding iaith. It struck me that might be useful in looking at the example from the book of Taliesin, which were geiriau anghyfiaith, or I think were regarded as being a sin, sort of improper and unfitting and so on. So I just thought that could possibly be helpful in sort of trying to decide to what extent language is being foregrounded in these terms.
Diolch. Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and yes, a useful comparison. So several points I would make. First of all, yes, cyfiaith it seems to be used in a much more personal sense between certain individuals rather than applied to a group of people, as we see with anghyfiaith. And there are numerous other examples in the Brita Tywysogion poems of that. And there's also an instance, I think, of anghyfiaith, of cyfiaith being used in that way in Historia de Carlo Magno, where one of the individuals is relieved that the person is cyfiaith with them, but there the iaith element is important because it means that they can communicate. So clearly there the iaith element is important. Generally, as you go later, cyfiaith does appear in some of the poems of Beddr Helwyd to refer to a group of people, I think. So perhaps a bit of a shift there. But with anghyfiaith, I think there is a different usage in that it is used much more consistently, especially in the prose texts, to refer to a collective. So the focus is not on the personal relationship. But you're right that there are some ambiguous references in the poetry that might be working in a different way. And in that respect, the comparison with cyfiaith in the poems might be helpful.
Diolch.
Diolch, Dylan.
Diolch yn fawr, Rebecca, dwi'n mwynhau hwnna, diolch yn fawr iawn. It's interesting that these terms, of course, as you started off saying quite rightly, are sort of semantic opposites, aren't they? They're the two sides of the same coin. Cyfiaith and anghyfiaith, and it sort of constructs a world view where you are either one or the other, with nothing in between, whereas presumably reality would have been very different. And linguistically, there would have been bilinguals and people with various linguistic capabilities, as we can see from other sources. Later on, of course, it's going beyond the scope of your paper, really, but you get a word like llediaeth appearing from Dafydd ap Gwilym onwards there, referring, although the meaning of that is not clear either, totally clear, but it's referring in a possibly negative way, possibly not, to a kind of language that is different or shows the influence of other, maybe English, other languages. Is there anything in the material that you looked at which sort of breaks down that binary situation, to suggest that there's a terminology that does suggest a middle position, so to speak, between cyfiaith and anghyfiaith?
Nothing springs to mind, although the perhaps an interesting related point is about the way that anghyfiaith is used in the laws in relation to alltyd, in that from the different passages, in some cases, it's the case that the point that's important is that the alltyd is anghyfiaith rather than the status as alltyd per se. And so there's perhaps a recognition that you could be an alltyd who did have an understanding of the language, and that qualification is needed.
Yeah, just to say on alltyd, yes, you're right. There is a pathway from alltyd to being a Cymro, isn't there? Well, it's not very easy, and it's not necessarily one generation either. You might be looking at your offspring, but there is that allowance for movement there, isn't there, from one camp to the other? You're quite right. That's interesting. And Dafydd ap Gwilym is obviously the type of material there is very different to the type of material that you're dealing with.
I think Historia Gruffydd ap Cynan is a bit interesting in that respect as well, because even though anghyfiaith is clearly a negative label for the Anglo-Normans, elsewhere in the biography, it's a good thing to speak multiple languages. Griffith's ability to speak lots of different languages is something that is proclaimed to be a good thing, and evidence of his learning and connections with other peoples. So again, there's the division of us and them camp, but actually it's much more complicated than that beyond the anghyfiaith.
David Benfras as well, isn't it? The famous references to different languages, although it's not entirely clear what exactly he's saying or what exactly the ideal position would be there for a speaker in his position. But yes, thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr.
Oes yna ragor o sylwadau neu gwestiynau? Do you have any further questions or comments? I'm trying to see if I can
Hello, can I just make a passing reference to the cyfiaith in Canu Cadfan? I think it might actually be a reference to it's from the same country, because it's referring to Lleiad and Cadfan, of course, who are believed to have come from Brittany, travelled. They were cousins and believed to have come together. And so it could be interpreted perhaps as of the same country, of the same tongue.
Yeah.
Unrhyw sylwadau pellach neu gyfraniadau pellach? Robert, ydych chi'n dymuno cyfrannu? Would you like to take the floor?
Hoffwn i ddiolch yn fawr i Rebecca am y cyflwyniad difyr. Un peth yn anharwi, Rebecca, do you think that anghyfiaith is used not just objectively and adjectively to describe those who speak differently? Do you get the sense of something derogative as well? So that it means actually not those who speak differently, but those who just can't speak properly, those who talk gibberish, those who aren't on the same level as us.
Diolch. Well, I think sort of just to unpack that a bit. First of all, there is definitely negative connotations in its usage in texts like Brut y Brenhinedd, where these are pagans. They speak a different language, and whether that language is not Welsh or not Latin, it's certainly not. It's lesser because of that. And then you've also got the more ambiguous references in poetry, like the one in Dadl y that I quoted, where it might be that geiriau anghyfiaith is sort of words that are not proper in speech or something like that. So it's a bit more vague in its meaning, but again with the derogatory connotations of this is not sort of the language that we want to be speaking.
So outside medieval times, it's, to come to that shade of meaning, Griffith Robert, the grammarian in the 16th century, he juxtaposes geiriau anghyfiaith and Cymraeg rhywiog, which is, there is an opposite, very much an opposite.
That's interesting, yeah.
Is it possible to think of, that the cyfiaith is the iaith that is meant to be spoken in this context, as you say, that sometimes it's Latin and sometimes it's Welsh or whatever form that we're talking about in that period, of course. But does that then suggest that because it means the language that is meant to be spoken, and then the anghyfiaith is the language that is not meant to be spoken, that you could then, in the Dadl y suggest that it's the parlance that isn't meant to be uttered in that kind of context. So it could therefore mean, swearing or other kinds of language forms that are not appropriate for that particular context.
Yeah, I think in Dadl y that's a good interpretation of it. That they're not words that you should be saying, and that's the soul's concern. I think going back to the prose examples, Brut y Brenhinedd especially, the point is the difference. I think not necessarily that it's just that it's wrong, but that this is a different language that they are speaking, just as they are of a different faith, and just as they are not united in the way we are. These are sort of all the list of differences, and that they are anghyfiaith is one of those.
So then it becomes sort of contextually based, doesn't it, in that sense?
Yeah. Well, I think you can see patterns in the prose texts in its usage, but then when you look more at the poetic evidence, it is much more varied. And yeah, it does depend on not in context.
Oes na sylwadau pellach a chwestiynau pellach? Dwi'n trio sgrolio fan hyn I weld. Dwi'n gweld pobl yn rhoi I microphones ymlaen. Do we have any additional questions or comments? I can sense there's a microphone coming on somewhere, but I can't work out where it is. Falle ddim. Wel, dyna ni, da ni wedi gorffan yn brydlon iawn am 6 o'r gloch fel hyn. Ac mi hoffwn ni ddiolch yn fawr iawn I Rebecca am bapur hynod ddiddorol a diolch am yr ymateb hefyd gynnwch chi gyd. Thank you very much, Rebecca. A wonderful paper and a great discussion too. Gai dynnu'ch sylw chi at y seminar nesaf sydd gennym ni gan y ganolfan ar yr 11 o Chwefror. A Little Close-Fisted, cysylltiadau cyfandirol Thomas Pennant, 1753-1765, gan y Dr Ffion Mai Jones. Felly edrychwn ni ymlaen at eich gweld chi pryd hynny a gymunwch â ni hefyd ar gyfer gweddill seminarau y ganolfan ar gyfer y tymor hwn. Thank you very much for joining us this evening and we look forward to seeing you in our next and the other seminars that we have in our series for 2021 spring term. Diolch yn fawr iawn I chi a noswaith dda.